good evening and welcome to episode 24 of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. Now, after last week's show, I must confess that I harboured a wish that this week we would be celebrating Scottish independence. And this graphic here, I think, epitomises the view of about 1.6 million Scots, allegedly, although apparently some 2 million thought otherwise. Now, it would be remiss of me not to pass some comment on the events of last Thursday, and actually perhaps even a few days before, because in the last two episodes of Humanity versus Insanity, I had passed comment and observation from my perspective regarding the potential for Scottish independence. Now, interestingly, neither of those two videos was accessible on either the day before, September 17th, or September 18th. So, call me a conspiracy theorist, but they were missing. Anyway, the day before, on the 17th, I sent out one of my occasional newsletters. And in that newsletter, I listed my base 12 points for Scotland achieving absolute independence. And I'd just like to run through these with you, just for the sake of posterity. Of course, those people who subscribe to my newsletter, which you can do so by putting your email address on the right-hand column of my website, which is ianrcrane.com. But if we can go back to those 12 points, and I'd just like to run through these, because this, for me, is a fundamental template for basically anyone wanting to establish absolute independence. Now, this is a very high-risk strategy, and I have to say that it will take a very brave and singularly courageous politician to promote this as his manifesto. But number one would be to establish an independent central bank of Scotland, free of Rothschild control. And in other words, this is basically to step away from usury and stepping away from a debt-based economy and establishing an economy very similar to the concept of the Bradbury pound. That, of course, would require the issuance of a new Scottish currency. And indeed, Scotland could have paid its debt, or as much of its debt as it felt like paying, using that Scottish currency, which could have then been spent on Scottish products, like oil, for example. Number four, take Scotland out of the EU. Norway and Switzerland operate quite coherently and with great cohesion with the EU, but they are outside of EU control. And the same goes for NATO, taking Scotland out of NATO, thereby effectively establishing Scotland as a neutral nation. Obviously, this would require strict currency controls for the first 3 years to avoid the Rothschilds, snakes, and banksters from destroying the Scottish economy before it even got off the ground. Demand the appropriate transfer of UK gold reserves to Scotland, but of course making sure that they are not put in the hands of Gordon Brown. He, of course, was instructed to sell a massive chunk of the UK's gold reserves when the price was rock bottom, just before the price was hiked to, was it $1,900 US dollars just a few years ago. This would have given an opportunity for Scotland to take back control of its NHS and establish a health service that the rest of the UK would envy. But unfortunately, that's unlikely to happen now. The new residency in Scotland linked directly to investment and contribution to the Scottish economy. Many countries, of course, apply this to date, which would have meant that, of course, all of the people coming to the UK for the opportunity to take the advantage of the benefit structure would not have had any motivation to cross the border into Scotland. Establishing a state employment agency to provide work and training for all able-bodied residents and ensuring that there is the appropriate support for those who, for whatever reason, are unable to work. And finally, members of secret societies to be barred from public office. Now, sadly, of course, it's extremely unlikely that any of that is going to occur. Now, in the days running up to the election, to the ballot rather, it was becoming increasingly apparent that there was a groundswell moving towards the idea of a yes vote. And this, I think, rocked the establishment. So much so that, of course, they sent their stormtroops into Scotland, and here we see them. And, of course, these individuals actually served only to further the move towards a yes vote. So, the purpose of putting these into Scotland, these individuals, these entities into Scotland a few days before the ballot was purely a charade. And it was going to have completely the opposite effect. The establishment knew that. That was coupled, of course, with the publication of the vow. I'm not going to bother to read this out, the vow, because it's basically not worth the Daily Record that it was printed on. So anybody who hasn't seen it, there it is on the screen. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can pause it and read for yourself the lies, the deceit, the obfuscation being presented by Cameron Miliband and Nick Clegg. And I'm sure that less than a week now after the ballot, they haven't got the first clue of what is contained in that document. So then come the fateful day, 18th of September 2014. Well, it's a day that certainly will be indelibly printed on my mind. First of all, it was the date in which I celebrated surviving 58 years on this mortal coil. And I'm pleased to announce that I intend to be a massive pain in the arse to the establishment for at least another 58 years. So it's a change, or I'd love to go play golf, actually, you know. So actually, I hope I'm not a pain in the arse for 58 years. I hope and I trust that we can bring about the change that we all know we need to see in that time, so that in my final years on this mortal coil, I can go back and play some golf. But let's have a look at what happened on that day in Scotland, because this day is surely going to be indelibly printed on the brains of many, many Scots. And I think as time goes on, it is going to be regarded as a massive missed opportunity. So let's have a look at the official statistics for last Thursday. So the turnout was remarkably high, nearly 85%. That's actually massive in terms of voter turnout. Many of the elections, it's barely even 30%, let alone 50%. So nearly 85%. Just 660,000 people apparently electing not to vote. 3.6 million people voting. So the final result, allegedly, was 45% in favour of establishing Scotland as an independent nation and 55% against. Let's have a look at how that broke down, because if we look at these stats, then effectively, with the exception of just 3 areas in Scotland, and 2 of them effectively being Glasgow and the immediate surrounds, everywhere else the majority was in favour of remaining with the Union, which would suggest that Scotland is really an extremely conservative country. Now, perhaps it's just me. Perhaps I just attract the firebrands around me. Perhaps I liaise with people who have significant capability and capacity for independent thought, that they perceive this as a tremendous opportunity. And I haven't yet come across one single person who I know who voted against independence. But like I say, that could simply be, you know, unrepresentative of the rest of the country. Obviously, the Shetlands and the Orkneys, they well, I say obviously, but they voted to remain in the Union. I mean, obviously, those two communities have done very, very well out of the oil bonanza, and perhaps perceived that they might not do quite so well in the event of Scottish independence. So, before I go on, let me just make the observation that, you know, perhaps tonight I can take the opportunity to take some questions from the shout box, the UK column shout box. This apparently is only available to members of UK column. But feel free, if you have a question, post it up and I'll try and address them. Alternatively, for those people who are not members of the UK column, then you could tweet, and the Twitter address is at @IAN, R, CRANE. So that's Ian R. Crane with all the initials capitalized, at Ian R. Crane. So send me a tweet and perhaps I'll try and address your questions. So let's just have a look at another stat here from Scotland. The areas of high unemployment actually tended to vote yes, obviously perceiving that an independent Scotland might address some of the less well-off areas, such as Glasgow and Dundee, for example. So what really happened? What absolutely happened on Thursday of last week? Well, you know, as Henry Kissinger said in 1973, in the immediate aftermath of the Chilean elections that put Salvador Allende into power, and Kissinger said that this is far too important for the Chilean people to decide. Well, call it a hunch, but I would hazard a guess that Scotland separating from the UK was just something that the establishment could never allow to happen. So they've been through the motions, they've been through the charade of a ballot for independence. 16% allegedly of those ballots were postal votes. Now that suggests a very high level of itinerance amongst the Scottish people, and of course the postal ballot provides an absolutely golden opportunity for the manipulation of the ultimate result. Plus, of course, we've been seeing videos and reports. Now, I am not going to make any comment on those videos. I've seen the videos, and I'm sure many of you watching have seen the videos that have been posted, but they're not corroborated. You know, in the ones that I've seen, there's no supportive statement as to where they were videoed or how they were videoed. But interestingly, the Russians who sent over a delegation to monitor the elections were extremely disparaging about the way in which the count was conducted in, you know, cavernous rooms that provided plenty of opportunity for manipulation. So whether it was, whether it wasn't, the reality is that it is wide open. The whole issue is wide open, and I'm sure will be discussed and debated for many generations, quite probably, to come. So let's just have a look at the shout box. Somebody says, was he already Henry Kissinger then, or was he still Heinrich Kissinger? Well, either way, he has been a master manipulator of the geopolitical arena for much of the last 50-plus years. It was Kissinger who effectively manipulated the US into the war with Vietnam. He was the manipulator of the Gulf of Tonkin event in, what was that, 1968, I believe. So, yeah, that's a good nearly 50 years that Kissinger has been at the heart of the geopolitical manipulation. Now, let's just see if we've got any tweets coming in. I think Mike is trying to check on my Twitter account there and see if anything's coming through. Nothing as yet. Nothing as yet. Well, there you go, all to play for. So, Scotland. Where do you go from here? Well, I have a very nasty feeling that all those promises that Cameron made, along with Miliband and Clegg, are about to be thrown right out of the window. I don't somehow perceive that Scotland is going to get any real benefit from remaining in the Union directly. Clearly, those who are the puppets of the Westminster establishment will do very well, and I'm sure they will be very, very well rewarded for managing the manipulation of the ballot. But what from here? Because we're already seeing cities in the north of England, like Manchester, seeking for greater independence from Westminster. So are we perhaps looking at the beginning of the balkanisation of the UK? Well, I certainly hope that that isn't the case. But what we have to do is we have to recognise that what happened here was another establishment manipulation. And ultimately, it is going to be down to the people, not just of Scotland, but the people of Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, to start recognising and acknowledging the fact that the political elite are simply the puppets of those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. And consequently, what they absolutely require is non-participation. Apathy. Apathy is quite possibly the greatest threat that humanity has ever faced. And the politicians absolutely rely on people being in a state of absolute stasis. Absolutely just ignoring the reality and running as fast as they can on that treadmill so that they are earning enough to get the latest toys and keep up with the latest soaps. And of course, be bullshitted with the latest media manipulation. So whilst Scotland was focused on its referendum, of course, the warmongers were manipulating the world into World War III. And of course, who's at the forefront of that? None other than Tony socio-psychopath Miranda, Charles Linton Blair. And apparently on his, I haven't seen it myself, but I was told just before I came on air, that on his Faith Foundation website, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, I almost want to gag as I say it, apparently on this website is a call to arms and a statement that basically the Western world needs to put boots on the ground and launch another attack on the Islamic State. So this is actually from an article that I believe is going to appear in the Daily Telegraph tomorrow. Tony Blair, people should at least listen to my advice on ISIS, as I have been to war in Iraq before. Like we need reminding. The former Prime Minister says that the lessons he learned taking decisions about the fallout from the 2003 war are worth appreciating. Now, Tony, you're the one who hasn't learned the lessons. We're the ones who have learned the lessons. You live in a world of cognitive dissonance. You are the epitome of a socio-psychopath. It actually pains me to acknowledge that I have a passport from the same country as you do. Fortunately, you are unable to walk the streets of the UK because you know that if you do, you will be vilified. Although you will, of course, make a good collection of shoes, which are all being saved up, ready for your state funeral, or whatever funeral can be mustered for you. The article goes on, Tony Blair has said that politicians should heed his advice that British boots on the ground in Iraq should not be ruled out because he had the experience of taking Britain to war in that country. The former Prime Minister said people should appreciate that he has learned lessons through going to war in Iraq and listen to his thoughts on tackling Islamic State, because they are precisely the same terrorist forces he battled during the conflict. His comments came as Lieutenant General Sir Graham Lamb, a former director of British Special Forces, said, "It's now time to rule in the idea of involving British ground forces in the conflict, like we have any left." The former Labour Prime Minister has said airstrikes would not be enough to defeat the jihadists who have taken control of large swathes of Iraq and Syria. Sending in combat troops to fight Islamic State militants on the ground should not be ruled out. Mr. Blair, whose premiership was defined by the Iraq War, has said that although there may be no appetite for a ground fight, it may become necessary. And there speaks the epitome of the socio-psychopathic politician. Let's not forget that it was Tony Blair who, in an interview with Andrew Marr, when asked how he actually managed to sleep at night, knowing that some 500,000 Iraqi civilians, mainly women and children, had lost their lives as a result of a war based on weapons of mass destruction, which we now are well aware didn't exist. And Tony Blair's considered response was, "Andrew, I think you'll find it was only 100,000. So in the mind of a socio-psychopath, 100,000 civilian deaths, mainly women and children, is acceptable collateral. Well, you know, not in my name, Tony, and not in the names of the vast majority of the British public. And you know that very well, as does David Cameron, who has also stated that he is determined to confront ISIS. Well, you know, consider the possibility that ISIS is actually the acronym for the intelligence services of the Israeli state. I consider that there's a very good possibility that ISIS is bought and paid for by those who stand to gain by furthering this conflict. You know, we're seeing this being pushed in Australia. We're seeing the threats of jihadists on the street of Australia, the threats of beheadings on the streets of Australia. And this is Tony Abbott's push to get Australia into World War III. Of course, we're not seeing that in the British media just yet, but it's probably just around the corner. So, of course, you know, the prime suspect for initiating the current state is Jihadi John, which the Murdoch media is taking great delight on ramping up. And, you know, we've seen, I think, is it 3 videos, inconclusive videos that actually look more like green screen productions than anything of reality. And, you know, we're seeing a situation now where the mythology is being created, and in reality, even those who are pumping out this mythology know that the vast majority of the public aren't going to buy it. Yet they're just going to keep pumping it, and they're going to use this as their excuse to launch us into World War III. So there's an increasing call to seek out Jihadi John and track him down. Well, let me give the intelligence services a bit of a clue here, because I think I've tracked him down. I think he's over here in West London, and he's a regular commuter to Pinewood Studios, where these green screen videos are probably being produced in an attempt to lure the gullible masses into World War III. Look, the reality is, the sad reality is, that the global political elite know that an increasing number of people are starting to realize that they are being hoodwinked. And they know that this increasing number of people are eventually going to reach a critical mass and will find a way to bring them down. Whether that be through the political process, or in some other way remains to be played out. But I am not speaking to anyone who is buying into this. And I know people are having random conversations in the streets when they're commuting to work, on the train or on the buses. And even though they're coming into contact with people who they wouldn't normally have conversations, perhaps, you know, the famous British commute, but they're starting to strike up conversations and talk about the lies, the deceit, and the deception, and the lack of fundamental humanity amongst those who perceive themselves to be the puppets of the ruling elite. So what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do? Well, you know, this is episode 24. We've already, unfortunately, had all the previous episodes of Humanity vs. Insanity and Fracking Nightmare, of course, removed from YouTube, thanks to the censorship of APVOD. But all of those episodes are now back up. They are back up on my YouTube channel. That's Ian R. Crane. And the playlist, those previous shows will be linked on the UK column website very shortly. Now, what I hope is that these programs and those programs of many others who are sharing similar insights are not simply a record to show that there were a few people who could see what was coming. Because, you know, there still is the risk that 50, 100 years down the road, then those who think they're the rightful rulers will get their World War III. And humanity may be on the brink of extinction, because that's what they've told us they want to achieve. But can we stop it? Of course we can. But it requires participation. And last week, we had Danny Bamping on the show. And Danny has launched a new political initiative, that of No TAR, none of the above. Now, for those of you who haven't seen that program, that was episode number 23 of Humanity vs. Insanity. I'd encourage you to go watch it. I'm not suggesting that No TAR is the definitive or the panacea, but nonetheless, it's an interesting initiative and it's one worthy of further consideration. And I'm sure, you know, we'll have Danny back on the program over the coming weeks. But this is what it's going to require. It's going to require everyone to get involved in some way, shape or form. Now, whether that's working on the social media, because obviously the social media is a tremendous tool, but the opposition can also use it as a tool. So the social media is just one aspect of this. What it's going to need is people to literally get out there and share, sow the seeds, encourage people to research this for themselves. Don't preach, just sow the seed, because that seed will have maximum impact when it germinates and the people come to their own realization of what is occurring. So right now, as I've said, apathy can absolutely kill. And this may well be the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced. So please, start thinking about how you can participate. Now, the UK column have a conference coming up on November the 1st at Sutton Coldfield. And I would encourage you to check out the UK column website. There's a second day to this event, which is featuring Dr. Graham Downing, who spoke at AB5. And the focus of the second day will be looking at the way in which we might be able to challenge the establishment, the ruling elite, when they unleash something upon us which can't be tackled by existing antibiotics. So this is 2 days. It's Saturday the 1st November and Sunday the 2nd November. It's 2 days. I would absolutely encourage you to check this event out. And if you can get along there, you will be amongst friends. You will be amongst like-minded people. And maybe, just maybe, you can stimulate further discussion and further ideas as to how we can break the existing paradigm. Now, part of breaking that existing paradigm is what is occurring on the anti-fracking front. And I'm going to be talking much more about that tonight on Fracking Nightmare, which will go out live at 9 o'clock, or of course it'll be up on YouTube sometime early tomorrow. Well, we've got a shorter program tonight, but thank you very much for joining me this evening. I am just going to revisit the chat shout box here. Someone's made the observation that I need a text jockey. I think someone's getting me confused with another show there. Somebody's asked, if Jihadi John is a jihadi, why does he dress up as a ninja? I think the answer to that is because that's all the costume department had at Pinewood Studios. Jihadi John is being interviewed on Sky TV tonight. Yeah, quite possibly. Sky TV obviously have tracked him down to his West London trailer. Yeah, I absolutely concur. Somebody here has said, Ian, please stop sitting on the fence. Do you like Blair or not? Oh, tough one. Not sure. Socio-psychopath. Tough call. Of course, Tony Blair was recently awarded a prize for Philanthropist of the Year by GQ magazine, which got a lot of attention. And let me tell you that I have the inside track on that. And GQ magazine actually awarded Tony Blair the Philanthropist of the Year award because they knew that that would achieve maximum publicity for GQ magazine. Had they awarded it to a real philanthropist, then it wouldn't have got a fraction of the publicity. So this is the perverse way in which the media works in this country. Yeah, Bush was already wearing his bomber jackets. Well, there we go. Any tweets, Mike, tonight? No. Oh, none of my viewers on Twitter. Well, that's a good sign, perhaps. Anyway, so there we have it. That's an early finish to Humanity versus Insanity tonight. And unfortunately, it's probably the end of the discussion on Scottish independence for at least a few weeks. But I know that there's at least 1.6 million people north of the border that perhaps have other ideas. So let's see how things unfold. Thanks for joining me tonight on episode 24. And join me in about an hour's time for Fracking Nightmare episode 37. Thanks very much and good night.